Hi, Tom.
Hi, Jace. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you, mate.
Had a good week?
Yeah, great. Thanks. Super duper.
Well, we're
How about
focusing.
you?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, well, the sun's been out, so, can't ask for much more, can you? Apart from a revolution.
Bit of sunshine and a complete restructuring of the way that society is run.
Oh, yeah. But 1 out of 2 is not bad, to be fair.
Well, take one of the two. Yeah.
Focus today, yet again, is going to be on a specific topic. So we've just moved away from the 10 by 6 formula momentarily, because the controversial nature, I think, of some of the issues and topics that we should discuss sometimes raise their heads to the surface. And I think one that's been ongoing now probably for 20 or 30 years is the nature of the abuse of children, sexual abuse of children, pedophilia that takes place within the establishment. We know full well that it's a disgusting experience for those victims across society who are the victims of these perpetrators, whether it be in the family, whether it be family friends, whether it be people in authority who take advantage. But it seems that one of the main facets of this abuse, right at the top end of society, it seems that the establishment and the establishment corporate media ultimately do their best to avoid any serious analysis and serious investigation into this topic. The reasons why, we can only guess, but it does leave a vacuum if those questions aren't answered about why the corporate media don't take it anywhere near as seriously as it needs to be taken, and why they always focus on the little people, so to speak. And of course, you've also got the far right response with Stephen Yaxley-Lennon and many people like him, who only want to focus upon people who are from an ethnic minority background and never mention the establishment in terms of their sex crimes. So it beggars, it beggars belief, but it also raises the serious question again, is who's behind a lot of this far right rhetoric and behavior? Is it principally just coming from their own bigotry and prejudice, or are they in fact puppets or stooges for something more powerful, with the aim to distract us and to distract many members of the white working classes, I would say as well, from a genuine question? Why is it the people at the top get away with it, and yet those in the rest of society, certainly from a working class background, are harassed not only by far right groups, but also the tabloid media, and obviously by the criminal justice system? Why is it they're special when people in the establishment who are also just human beings who are perpetrating vile and disgusting crimes largely allowed to hide? So what's your take first, Tom, in terms of why do you think the establishment tend to get away generation after generation with these vile crimes that nobody else in society would expect to?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen time and time again in different spheres, different sort of areas, that the establishment looks after itself. Protects itself, whether that's the monarchy, the ruling class, and always linked to the Conservative Party and the billionaire owners of most of our media, certainly the corporate media, and all of those things can be classed as the establishment. And even things like judges that have been judges for 50 years, who sometimes say the most appalling sexist things in their rulings on cases. So yeah, there's this establishment, most of which is privileged, most of which is white and male, and it always looks after itself, its position, its wealth, its power, and protects other elements of the establishment, because if one part of the establishment falls, it can endanger the rest. So they all look after each other. They don't even need to talk about it. It's an unspoken rule that all of that establishment machine that rules over us and runs society and even tells people what to think, what to believe, it always looks after itself. It's an unspoken rule that they're all involved in doing that. And that presents a real threat to the truth, which in itself is a threat to democracy and to all of us. And we've said it many times, but in this current age, the only real truth in terms of media is coming from independent media. It's not coming from corporate media. It's not coming from the main sources from which people get their news, sadly. That's all part of the establishment who don't just lie and cover up and spread propaganda on behalf of the establishment and the government, but they also omit. They lie through omission. They don't tell people things that they don't think the public should be aware of. So all of that is problematic for those that seek the truth, that wants facts and truth, and a society and a democracy that's based upon that. And I always say, without truth, there is no democracy. So it's a big problem. And once again, urge everyone watching this to follow good sources of independent media. There are loads and loads out there, but you have to kind of actively go to them and seek them out if you want to know what's really happening in our society today.
Yeah, I entirely agree with you in terms of accessing information and trying to find out more about what's going on. But one of the, I think, major issues around this specific topic is how those people who seek to investigate these particular crimes and based in this particular demographic put themselves at incredible risk, because if the establishment is pulling together to avoid identifying specifics within it, and they're prepared to go to actually very extensive lengths in order to prevent it, it's often very much about putting people off poking their noses in.
Yeah.
And I just want to bring it away from that a little bit about the nature of investigative journalism there, and focus a bit more on the victims, because what we have here is an untreated crime. In other words, if for example you or I were aware of this behavior going on, let's say in a house near close to us, and we knew it was going on, or we strongly suspected it was going on, then we would call either or social services or the police.
Mm-hmm.
And we would expect them to do a thorough investigation. We wouldn't call them unnecessarily. We wouldn't, hear rumor or whatever and then respond, you or I, this is. We're basing this hypothesis on pretty certain. So they would then investigate, but a part of that process would be then to take those children and to formulate, hopefully, some sort of protective ring around that child, which would involve counseling, therapy, redirecting them into safer, loving, more caring family backgrounds, to give them the experience that they're not experiencing at the moment. But what you have here with the establishment is a series of sex crimes that go back, as I say, over a long period of time, in which, by attempting to derail any serious investigation, also means that the victims historically have stayed exactly where they are and have continued to be abused. And these very victims, not only do they suffer horrific mental health issues, They also find that their opportunities within society are closed off, mostly because they just simply don't have the self-concept and the confidence in order to go out into that society and do something that a lot of people would just take for granted. So we're not just talking about establishment crimes, we are talking about the carnage, the absolute carnage that is still left in place by these people seeking to protect themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, we're suffering as a society from a huge levels, unprecedented probably levels of mental health problems and suicide. And how many of those, I wonder, are people that have historical child abuse in their history, and maybe have not even told anybody about it and are living with that and feeling powerless, you know, and particularly when these, you know, these crimes, I know you used the phrase sex crimes, which is right, but of course, you know, these are also crimes of power.
Yes,
You know, abuse, rape of children is very much about power, and abuse of power. And for the victims, they generally feel powerless, not just as children, but even as adults, and especially when the establishment that have all the power deny them any chance of justice, any chance whatsoever, chance of getting justice for most victims of historical child abuse, you know, seems pretty futile, pretty unlikely. And when the perpetrators are very powerful or high profile people, very little chance of getting justice. And so people feel completely powerless throughout their lives. These victims of historical child abuse tend to feel that powerlessness as they go on living their lives. And yeah, I would imagine that a considerable number of a percentage of our shockingly high suicide rates are people that have suffered in that way. So yeah, we have a huge issue with it. And
but another major issue, Tom,
if
I can just extend onto your narrative, is of course the alarming statistics that show that people who have been abused are much more likely to become abusers. And this isn't only reflected in child abuse, child sexual abuse and child rape, etc. It's also very much at the heart of the essence, as you talked about with power relationships, in terms of bullying. Evidence suggests that you are far more likely to become a bully yourself if you experienced bullying at some point during your childhood. Because it becomes not all of them, of course, but for some, it becomes their defense mechanism, their coping mechanism to try and take back the power. And because they've only ever experienced this level of disempowerment, i.e. through bullying, it becomes their norm. It becomes their almost dominant value system because it's been imposed on them psychologically by external factors beyond their control.
Yeah, and the opposite happens too. I mean, you're right, but that
yes,
for those that have been a victim and felt completely powerless, there may be some, I suppose, incentive, for want of a better word, to become the dominant person in a different relationship, through bullying or abuse or whatever. And that does happen. But likewise, there are people who've been victims of different forms of abuse, who don't want to abuse others. You know, the vast majority of victims don't want to abuse others because they feel the pain of it. They understand, they felt the pain of it, and they don't want to inflict that pain on anyone else in their life. You know, many of the strongest, many of the strongest, advocates for victim support and for being kind and empathetic and caring towards others are people who have suffered some sort of abuse. So it does work sort of both ways, yeah.
it works both ways, but statistically speaking, in terms of the, the statistics and the data that have come from social services, is that they find that between 85 and 90% of sexual abusers have themselves been abused. So we know that there is very much a cause and effect based upon their experiences in childhood. And of course, yes, there's many people who were abused who found ways, mechanisms, people, support to enable them to, find strategies to come out of their experience of abuse in such a way as that they were able to use that empathy and understanding or whatever in order to be able to avoid going down that road. But it is a frightening level of cause and effect, so we say, that approximately 90% of all sexual abusers have been abused. So we know that there is that linear, so to speak, that linear correlation. Something else I want to talk about as well is the morals and values that exist within society. So for you and I, and a lot of us, we find the idea that children being abused sexually abhorrent. And we don't have that collectiveness like the establishment does, where it's able to come together and say, okay, let's deal with this internally. Whereas the establishment, and we're talking across the board here, positions in high-ranking authority, which includes the police, which includes social services, which includes the probation service, which includes no end of different services. They are able to bring those people together, and that includes the corporate media, to just shut the door shut, to slam the door shut. So even though we have that morality and those value systems within society, the establishment, even though that some of them surely must perceive it as being abhorrent, they still keep zip. Whereas a lot of people in wider society simply wouldn't contemplate staying zip. Yeah. So we need to be aware also of the subculture, I think, in which the establishment have evolved in from childhood through public schools and the nature of their parenting expectations all the way through, that lead them to perceive shutting that door shut and protecting each other is more important than any other behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're right. There isn't because we are powerless generally. There are ways that ordinary people can become powerful when they join together. When they join in collective action, when they show solidarity and take a stand together for each other's rights. Then we become the majority and the powerful. But it's rare that we're allowed to do that. We're persuaded not to do that. And we see the demise of unions over the last 30 plus years. We're encouraged not to take collective action, but that is where our power comes. But I did want to.
Can I just add in there before you continue, Tom? Because but what we're talking about here is a collective action to hide abhorrent behavior. It's not collective action to unite together in order to orchestrate social change. We must make that clear.
From on the part of the establishment, you mean?
No, I'm part of the work. I'm part of us. Yeah, what I'm talking about, this collectivity here is not a collectivity for good. But what we tend to do is we don't have that collectivity to deny the abuse that's going on 3 doors down. Whereas the establishment will just shut the door because they are part of the establishment, therefore everybody has to keep zip. We don't do that. We'll report it to social services and the police. So therefore, in this instance, that collective belief that we are more important than any individual behavior doesn't exist.
Yeah, I understand. So I did want to, I think it's important to just do a little segue here to point out the dangers of the far right and QAnon, because there is, of course, a danger that the whole issue of paedophilia and child sex abuse is usurped by the far right and by the conspiracy theorists, Trump supporting nutcases. And to some extent, that has certainly happened in the last few years. You know, the QAnon, obviously, this ridiculous conspiracy theory, right-wing conspiracy theory, promotes, you know, which is basically founded on the idea that there is an elite group of global, you know, powerful elite pedophiles, most of whom are either Democrats, politicians, or celebrity supporters of Democrat politicians, and that you know, they operate this vast network of sort of paedophile rings, and they keep thousands of children in underground bunkers where they abuse them, and you know, and pizzerias where they're taken for abuse in Washington, all of which, you know, is utter nonsense and rubbish. And you know, and that the Clintons and you know, and Bill Gates and various other people are you know, involved in this, and that the only person that can bring all this truth out and stop all of this is Donald Trump. He's the only person that's able to stop this terrible paedophile against our children, and that QAnon conspiracy theory that engulfed millions of people and still does, although it, you know, it has then morphed, if you like. QAnon was like a gateway conspiracy theory. It was the first conspiracy theory that a lot of people in America and Britain, even across Europe, believed in, and now they've got sucked into a load of other right-wing conspiracy theories. But it gave rise to this movement of save our children. Save our children, not save the children, the charity. So save our children. And there was hashtag save our children. It became a big thing. And that was, of course, totally linked to and promoted by the QAnon conspiracy theory movement, the pro-Trump movement. And again, caught lots of people, very well-meaning, decent people who wanted to stand up against paedophilia and abuse of children, you know, as most normal, right-minded people would do, would want to demonstrate about that, protest about that, about abuse. And so people got interested in that, campaigned, went to demonstrations, you know, but these were very right-wing, pro-Trump demonstrations, and you know, carefully managed by people that were supporters of Trump, that hooked people into this Save Our Children phenomenon. And it's very dangerous. And the real organizations, the real charities and services that support victims of child abuse were saying, this is unhelpful. This Save Our Children movement, this QAnon movement, is very, very unhelpful to the real victims of child abuse and to our services that support them. You're actively damaging them. And of course, QAnon then led to people, you know, committing crimes, committing really awful, heinous crimes, including kidnapping. So, you know, very, very dangerous thing. And the other just thing I wanted to sound a warning about in terms of the far right was, we all know that the far right have often banged on about paedophilia. It's one of their things that they try and lure supporters in with, a bit like QAnon. They know that, you know, if they say they're anti-paedophile and bang on about paedophiles all the time, that they'll get a certain level of support because of that. Of course, it turns out that, you know, amongst leaders of various far-right organisations, historically, there's been a high proportion of people who are paedophiles and who have been convicted of being paedophiles, which I imagine is to do with their love of the abuse of power and that feeling of being in control, in authority, and having power over vulnerable people. It's something they get a kick out of. So yeah, you know, I just wanted to sound that big warning. What we're talking about today, we're talking about this very serious matter of paedophilia, including the members of the elite, if you like, members of the you know, the authority and privileged people who've been involved in paedophilia. But we're talking about it factually, and we're sounding a warning about the nonsense, the conspiracy theories, and the messages from the far right. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But in essence, it comes back to something else that you said earlier. It comes back to the nature of power, and it comes back to who people are brainwashed or socially conditioned into wanting in power. And anything that stands in its way, anything that stands in its way is fair game. So even when you have, as we've talked about, the multiple victims as a result of multiple abuse, if it becomes inconvenient to a particular power bloc, whether it be the Republicans, the Democrats, the Conservatives, the Labour Party, wherever you are on the planet, if it becomes inconvenient, it's hidden or swept away. Then, when it becomes convenient, it's swept back in again. It's just a plaything. It's just a tool for power. And that in itself is the ultimate problem we have within our society. Because we talk about, can I just say, sorry, we talk about values, we talk about, morality, we talk about a whole range of aspects that are part of us from social conditioning. And yet, they become entirely irrelevant when it's about taking power or keeping power.
Yeah. And alongside power, I wanted to raise the issue of leverage. And when you say certain things are swept under the carpet or swept back in when it's convenient, something that powerful people are very used to doing is exercising leverage, using leverage to get what they want. And it's something that, if you like, the ordinary person doesn't really consider, doesn't think about how can they use leverage. But it's something that, someone like Trump, for example, spent his whole life abusing power by using leverage in whatever way he can to do, business deals that favor him, or to, get what he wants in various ways, some of which, very likely to be illegal ways, as we saw when he was president. So an abuse of power by using leverage in a illegal way. So, I mean, for example, if MPs, I would say more likely to be of one particular party, if MPs are found to have done something wrong, maybe that's something illegal, maybe it's something to do with child abuse. If that is known by the leaders of their parties and their whips, are they going to go public with it and force that MP to resign? Or are they going to keep it under wraps and use it to coerce that MP to vote for whatever they want them to vote for? And I think that over a period of time, they've done the latter. I think that there are probably numerous MPs that have done illegal things, including abuse of children. And our leaders, the leaders of their parties, have not made that public, not involved the police in that, not had them prosecuted or anything like that. They've basically, in cahoots with their chief whip, said, yeah, when we really need them to vote for this, we'll be having a word with them and making sure that they vote with us. Otherwise, we'll go public with their atrocities. So that sort of leverage is how the power is used by the powerful in that way, which of course is despicable. But we need to be aware that that's how these things work.
This isn't a hypothesis, Tom, either. I mean, this is fact. We know it's fact because we ourselves at Dorset I have a video from the chief whip in 1985 who admits this. There's no holding back. He's aware of young boys being abused by MPs, which is kept in-house, and it then becomes their favour to pay back. Yeah. This is all admitted nearly 40 years ago. And it shows, doesn't it, even when the chief whip came out in a programme and admitted it, and nothing has been done, certainly from the public's perspective, in the next 4 decades, suggests, again, how the establishment perceive it. They must perceive themselves as being entirely untouchable.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Can we just, if we just focus on an investigation that took place by a magazine called Scallywag. Now, the Scallywag, I don't know if you know, Tom, was a sort of a magazine in the 1980s that was set up by a number of people, but chief amongst them was a guy called Simon Regan, and he would uncover, you know, the Masonic Freemasonry that took place within the police force locally, and how it was the Freemasons who were determining whether people ended up being prosecuted, for example. He found that, you know, the chief superintendent of the time was himself a big player in the Freemasonry. And he was really basically trying to expose this to the public, probably at a time when deference was much greater and people didn't perceive the Freemasons in quite the same way as they do now, much more cynically and suspiciously. But a whole range of stories, don't get me wrong, it wasn't just about Freemasonry, but that was just an example. But one of the investigations that he did, along with his brother, and it needs to be stated before I read this out, that both he and his brother died relatively suspiciously 5 years apart. And again, it could be entirely, you know, a conspiracy theory, and that people have filled the vacuum with information that is inaccurate. But that's irrelevant. What he was doing was operating not only locally, but he also started operating in London. And if I can just read this part of something that we published on Dorset Eye back in 2016, and it very much links, we go to the title, for example, between Margaret Thatcher, William Hague, Leon Britton, who are prominent, historically prominent Conservative MPs, Dolphin Square, North Wales, and the VIP child abuse connection. Now, a lot of things have come out from around that time and before, the 60s, 70s, 80s, into the 90s, in which we have been informed by various sources that something very dark and sinister was going on. But for obvious reasons, and the reasons we've identified up until this point, it's extremely difficult to get full-on data, information, sources validated that will expose them 100%, because the doors have been slammed shut. But what we have here, this is just a little segment. The fact that the Waterhouse report, which, as I say, was a report that was published just over 20 years ago, went so far as it did, is highly commendable. So I'd suggest that people go and read the Waterhouse report for themselves, and obviously long overdue. But the trouble with any investigation which tries to break through a cult of silence is the lingering doubts that it will ever get down to the whole full truth of the matter. Waterhouse is probably merely the tip of the iceberg. The report suggests there is no evidence, so it comes back to this one again, that Freemasonry had anything to do with the scandal. Yet there were 2 inadequate and inconclusive police inquiries, including one into a senior officer by a force in North Wales riddled with Freemasons. There was a consistent lack of initiative on the part of the local Clwyd CC in the face of overwhelming evidence of consistent child abuse at Brynyston, ostensibly because the council insurers advised against any action. This in itself insults democracy in a way that borders on the criminal. By a policy of non-action, both the police and the council became embroiled in a blatant cover-up. Anyone who has even vaguely become acquainted with paedophilia knows very well that they will go to the ends of the earth to keep their activities absolutely secret. They are professional experts in covering their tracks. In the early 90s, in the now defunct Scallywag magazine, which I founded, just Simon Regan, we interviewed in some depth 12 former inmates at Brynyston who had all been involved in the Wrexham paedophile ring. which the tribunal acknowledges existed. Most of these interviews were extremely harrowing and disturbing, but were gently and sensitively conducted over pub lunches where the victim could relax. We subsequently persuaded 10 of them to make sworn affidavits, which we proposed to use as backup up to half a dozen paedophile stories we later published. 2 of these young men, who had been 14 years old at the time, swore they had been not only introduced to the paedophile ring operating in the Crest Hotel in Wrexham, but had later been escorted on 3 or 4 occasions to address in Pimlico, where they were further abused. So now we're taking people from North Wales, Tom, to London. We took them separately to Pimlico and asked them to point out the building where this had taken place. They were both positive in their identification. It turned out to be the private flat of a well-known and since highly discredited lobbyist who later went into obscurity in some disgrace because of involvement with Mohammed Al-Fayed and the Cash for Questions scandal. At the time, we ran a story entitled Boys for Questions and named several prominent members of the then Thatcher government. These allegations went to the very top, excuse me, of the Tory party, and there was a curious and almost ominous lack of writs. So why do you think that would be, Tom? Do you think the legal advice that they were given was that you're going to be exposed to so much more, to get your head down and keep it quiet?
Yeah.
The lobbyist was a notorious queen who specialised in gay parties with a political mix in the Pimlico area, most convenient to the Commons, and which included selected flats in Dolphin Square. The 2 young men were able to give us very graphic descriptions of just what went on, including acts of buggery, and alleged that they were only 2 of many from children's homes other than North Wales. So here we have, as I said before, high-ranking members, probably, of social services, social workers, etc., who had to be involved in order to escort these children from the care homes to where they were abused and then take them back. There was, to my certain knowledge, at least 1 resignation from the Conservative office in Smith Square once we had published our evidence and named names. We can only guess why they resigned, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they were involved in any sexual abuse. It could have been part of the process of not being able to keep this quiet, and they needed to find somebody else who was much better able at hiding things. Subsequently, over a rent dispute, which is still a matter of litigation, Dr. Julian Lewis, now Conservative MP for New Forest East, but then Deputy Head of Research at Conservative Central Office in Smith Square, managed to purchase the contents of our offices, which included all our files. It had been alleged that we owed rent, which we disputed, but under a court order, the landlords were able to change the locks and seize our assets, which included all our files, including those we had made on paedophiles. It was apparently quite legal, but it was most certainly a dirty trick. All of a sudden, very private information, some of it even privileged between ourselves and our lawyer during the John Major libel action. And this, interestingly, this John Major libel action, Tom, was around the fact that he was having an affair, which he denied, which of course, they then started a libel action against the magazine, which we then found out, of course, post was absolutely true. So this was a way of protecting John Major while he was in government, knowing that the effect upon him and the party would be much less when he left Parliament.
Yeah, this was the affair with Edwina Curry, was it?
It was, but they weren't sure who it was. In fact, they named another woman at the time. So instead of him just coming out and apologizing, said, yeah, you've got the wrong woman, blah, blah, blah. But both of them, of course, were quite central at the core of the Conservative Party back in the 90s at this time.
Yeah. And again, in terms of leverage, we can imagine people, people going to Major and saying, we will support you in this, libel action regarding your affair. We'll deny things and totally support you. If you will then turn a blind eye and deny the, atrocious acts and child abuse committed by some of your MPs, everything can be swept under the carpet. Yeah.
I mean, it's that possible that that happened. And of course, we don't know. It may well be that the leverage they had on John Major, they took in another direction, because at that point in time, it was more politically appropriate for them. Subsequently, during a court case initiated by Lewis, I was able, with my defence, to seek discovery of documents and asked to see the seized files. The paedophile papers were missing. This is a very great shame, because Ronald Waterhouse certainly should have been aware of them. I believe that the secrecy the establishment wraps around itself easily equals that of the paedophiles. They really do look after each other and quite professionally cover their tracks. The real trouble about exposing paedophiles is that former victims of child abuse make lousy witnesses. By the very nature of the abuse, when they are rudely shoved out into the wide world, one of the witnesses, Stephen Mesham, for example, was released on his 16th birthday on Christmas Day after 2 years of abuse and had to sleep rough on the streets for 4.5 months. They are often deeply psychologically disturbed. Some of the extreme cases commit suicide, as you rightfully identified earlier, Tom. Many more were sexually disorientated in the worst possible way. Some became gay prostitutes, others drug addicts, and in nearly every case at some stage they needed lengthy counselling. Marriages quickly disintegrated in psychological turmoil, and a lot of former victims have real difficulties raising their own children. There are very few victims of child abuse who come out of it without deep scars. It was all very well for us to take statements from former victims in the cosy atmosphere of a pub lunch, but put them up against an agile and eminent QC whose sole task is to discredit them. And they quickly crumble, even break down in tears. Many former victims now have criminal records of some kind, owing almost exclusively to the abuse itself. And the barrister will brutally exploit this as evidence that the witness is unreliable and tainted, faced with the choice of a clearly neurotic young man who quickly falls down in the witness box and a smooth, experienced, erudite, and often highly respected culprit. Juries tend to give the accused the benefit of the doubt. I watched it in the now famous Court 13 at the High Court during the libel action between former Superintendent Gordon Anglesey and Private Eye and others, when, despite the fact that under cross-examination Anglesey had to admit that his evidence did not correspond with his own notebooks, the other side subsequently tore the 5 main prosecution witnesses to pieces in a monumental act of judicial harassment. Like the whole story of child abuse in North Wales and elsewhere, it broke my heart. And I suggest that people also go on to this article on Dorset Eye, as I say, entitled Margaret Thatcher, William Hague, Leon Britton, Dolphin Square, North Wales, and the VIP of child abuse connection. And also read the connection that has to, as I say, certain members of the upper echelons of the Conservative Party at the time, and then start to do their own investigation, start to do their own research, start to ask questions, start to challenge their preconceived ideas that they've been fed by the corporate media, etc., over a long period of time, because that's the only way we're going to get enough people to stand up and say, the victim in this situation should come first, not hiding the perpetrators.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's devastating. It's really hard to respond to, isn't it? Because we're just looking at one case, one group of people who have been systemically abused, not only by paedophile perpetrators, but then by a criminal justice system that should be there to protect them and defend them and to get to the truth. But it's doing everything but, especially where the establishment in paedophilia is concerned.
Yeah, and that last section about discrediting witnesses, you know, abused, vulnerable people, psychologically damaged by their abuse that has led them into desperate lives that sometimes involves crime, and then they're completely discredited because of that by the lawyers. It's pretty sickening, and yeah, I've had first-hand experience of a courtroom situation where lawyers set out to discredit witnesses, and yeah, I guess our judicial system is somewhat based upon that. You know, that's what defence barristers do. They'll set out just to discredit a witness, and they can be ruthless.
And you know full well, Tom, don't you, that the rich can afford the most experienced, the best, whereas the rest of us have to take from the rest, the other pool. And often, if you turn up in a magistrate's court on a Monday morning or whatever, you get somebody who's just qualified, who has no experience. And in this situation where you really need somebody who's on their game, you suffer as a result. Whereas the rich and the powerful, they just phone up Sir this or Baron that, and this person turns up, does their job, and if you don't get them off the hook, you usually find for some reason that even when they're sent down, I mean, the Guinness trial is a classic example, they just claim they've got dementia. He was out, what was it, after 6 months, and it then found out that he didn't, you know, he had no symptoms of dementia whatsoever.
Spend a nice 6 months in an open prison with some other you know, wealthy, privileged embezzlers and fraudsters, and then come out.
And the corporate media,
some of the sentencing of rich, privileged people is beyond a joke, isn't it? Some of it's just ridiculous.
And so is the corporate media coverage, because it hides so much. And you know, it keeps it low key when they're released. It doesn't tell you all about the later bits where, you know, 6 months later when they tracked down Guinness and they found out that you didn't have it, and they put it all over the front pages. It doesn't happen.
Worth also mentioning, you know, in terms of access to justice, to legal representation. Of course, everyone's entitled to legal representation. As you say, it's often, you know, if you're not wealthy, you get sometimes fairly basic legal representation. And worth also pointing out that under this Conservative government, our right to legal support and representation is under threat, has been attacked, has been reduced, particularly with cuts to legal aid for the poor. And it just should not be that access to justice is fully there for the rich and not for the poor.
Well, ideally, we wouldn't have rich and poor. It's only the system that creates rich and poor. But of course, that then brings with it multiple symptoms of that differential. So whereas we should be focusing upon making society much more equal, much fairer, providing the opportunities across the board from education to whatever, and health, there seems to be no ideological interest in that. So if that's what people support, they have to support everything that comes with it. They have to. Certainly once they've been made aware of it. If you vote for this, you get all of this. And therefore, please don't moan about all of this, because you legitimated it. To finish off, Tom, we just probably it could easily have been a starting point, but it's one of probably the most famous cases at the moment is that of Jeffrey Epstein, and how he was friends with celebrities, people in the establishment, and obviously he was arrested, charged, taken to prison, and within a short space of time he apparently took his own life, which many of course simply don't believe, or they believe that he was helped, shall we say. And of course, we now have the situation with Ghislaine Maxwell, the daughter of Robert Maxwell, who himself is somebody who abused power most of his life. So, you know, that was where she came from in terms of a social conditioning. And what we've done is we've published information that we were sent from Epstein's little black book. People can go on the site and they can look for themselves. But what we sort of spent half a day doing was just looking up some of the people that you can find below in that little black book. And again, I'm not going to go through the lot, you know, I'm just going to hold it here and just whiz through. But there's some very famous names. There's some very famous ex-prime ministers and presidents. Now, we're not stating that because they were in Jeffrey Epstein's little black book that they were involved in sex crimes. We are just posing the question, really, that you and me, Tom, and 7.5 billion people aren't in his little black book, but hundreds of people are. And he was a renowned organizer of sexual abuse and paedophilia. So I wouldn't want to be in his book. Would you, Tom?
Sorry, my screen froze for a moment. Sorry, we lost connection for 20 seconds or so there, Jace.
Okay, I was just basically saying that there are 7.5 billion people who aren't in the little black book of Jeffrey Epstein, but there are hundreds of people who are. So given the nature of his crimes, you know, the organizer for sexual abuse and paedophilia, I'm actually very glad that I'm not in his little black book, but as I said, hundreds of people are. So I think we just need to finish off by summarizing the fact that this isn't historical. This is right now. The establishment are still shutting the doors on investigations and going potentially to the greatest lengths they can in order to ensure that this information doesn't come out and expose certain people.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, of the hundreds of people that are in Epstein's little black book, I mean, obviously the vast majority of them will be nothing to do with paedophilia and child sex abuse, and you know, the vast majority won't have. Some may not have even known or met Epstein, may not have, you know, been to events that he put on, or been to his island, or been on his private jet or whatever. But obviously some were, and as you say, as well as some high-profile celebrities, there were also a lot of high-ranking politicians and members of royal families across the globe. And it seems likely that one of the things that Epstein did, as well as being what looks like a prolific paedophile himself, it looks like he arranged access to children to be abused by various powerful adults, and Epstein would have then used that as leverage with those powerful adults to get what he wants from them, or to, you know, or to just have it for the future, so he can get something from them in the future, whether it's money or access or power or a deal or whatever from these people, you know, whether he was blackmailing people or exerting pressure on people, you know, with the knowledge that, you know, that they had engaged in acts of abuse against children.
I'm not even sure.
He probably was using that.
I'm not even sure, Tom, whether he would have needed to be fair, because if he already had his own island and a private jet, he seems to be being remunerated very nicely, thank you very much, for what he was doing. So I suspect he was part of the in crowd and they didn't suspect, you know, whatever. that he would do such a thing. I suppose the really interesting thing, though, is that at the end, what was it that led to him being allowed to be arrested? I mean, you know, a lot of people will contemplate the fact that he died in his cell. But if the establishment is so tight in protecting all those people that can uncover their secrets, something, a catalyst, something must have happened that allowed the police to come and arrest him, which is probably something that, you know, needs to be really investigated, because it might change the whole direction of understanding what happened.
Yeah.
And I think that's a commonality, to be fair, across the board. And it goes back to what we said at the very beginning. By shutting the door, they create the vacuum. Many people then fill that vacuum, sometimes with facts, sometimes with anti-facts. But until, in a democracy, which you identified very early on too, we are allowed to act democratically, which means opening everything up, exposing reality and letting people judge for themselves, it isn't going to happen.
No. No. Well, we need a society, we need to move more towards a society based on truth and facts and justice and democracy. And at the moment, we seem to be moving further and further away from that, as America is, as much of the world is, particularly under right-wing governments. We're moving further away from truth and democracy. And of course, the global, you know, billionaire owners of the media are very, very responsible for that progress towards a less truthful and democratic world. And it's really dangerous, and everyone should be aware of it and support and follow independent truth-telling media, and join, you know, say we get power. There's more of us than there are of them. We're talking about the 1% here. You know, we're talking about the 1% of billionaires and multimillionaires that currently run the world, and are moving us in these terrible directions. You know, the more we act collectively as the 99% to demand truth and fact, to demand justice, to give power to the powerless, and you know, to find that truth through truth-telling independent media, then the better we'll be, the more chance we have of a future for our grandchildren.
Yeah, that's a brilliant place to stop. Brilliant place to stop. Resist, and turn to those sources, turn to those places that bring reality, but are also much more beneficial to the people around you. Thank you for watching, everybody. Thank you, Tom, yet again.
Thank you.
See you next week, mate. You take care.
All right, you too. Thanks, everyone. Bye.